So, the title of the message that I want to bring to you today, I've called this, Lord, Teach Me to Dance. Lord, teach me to dance. And of all the topics for me to get up and speak to you about today, of all the topics in the whole wide world for me to talk about, I never in a million years thought that dance would be one of them. Because anyone who knows me, anyone who's met me or spent any amount of time with me will tell you that I am the most clumsy, footless, unrhythmical person you've ever met in your life. I mean, I am not exaggerating when I say that I do not have a beat in my body. I cannot dance to save my life. I can manage, the Macarena. I can manage the Macarena and maybe the cha-cha slide at a push, but other than that, I cannot dance. Even in kids' church, when we're dancing in there and doing actions to songs, the kids sometimes say to me, Lauren, you're doing it wrong. Or sometimes they say, that's not how we done it last week. Even the kids can tell you that I can't dance. And I think what went wrong for me is I think I inherited my mummy's dancing abilities, because she can't dance either. My granny's laughing. She can't dance either. I hear she was good at the Shankle Shuffle back in the day, but I've never seen her do it, so I don't really know. My granny was a good dancer. She has medals for Irish dancing, and she says when she loses a wee bit of weight, she's going to be up to the Irish dancing. And we all know Rebecca and Emma are both brilliant dancers, but me, I cannot dance at all. So even as I was putting this message together, I was thinking to myself, why on earth am I talking about dancing? Why, God, have you got me speaking about dance? But the more I looked at what the Bible had to say about dancing, the more it encouraged me and the more it blessed me. And I'm hoping that when I share a wee bit about what I have to say today, that it'll encourage you and bless you as well. The Bible has a few different verses and a few different stories about dancing. And what I want to do is talk to you about two people in the Bible who danced for God. I want to look at why they danced and how it relates to our lives today. Because if you're like me and you're sitting there thinking, Lauren, I don't know the first thing about dancing, then don't worry, I believe that you can still get something from this message today. Because really, when you look at the Bible, dancing was just another form of worship. When we come into church this morning, we sing, we close our eyes, we lift our hands as a way of focusing on God, as a way of showing Him our worship. And whenever you look back at the Bible, dancing really was just another form of worship in these stories that I'm going to share. So the first person, here we go, the first person that I want to talk about who danced was a girl called Miriam, and I'll give you a wee bit of background to her story. So a lot of you will know Miriam was the Moses of a man called Sister. We're off to a good start today, we're off to a good start. Miriam was the sister of a man called Moses, and she was the one who watched over Moses when his mummy had to put him in a basket and send him up a river in order to protect him. Because you see, Moses and Miriam, they were Israelites, they were Hebrews, and there was this group of people called the Egyptians who were after the Hebrews, and they wanted to make them their slaves. And they were really evil in the way that they went about it, because they even went out to kill and destroy all the Hebrew baby boys who were under 2 years old. And Moses' mummy, we all know the story, she has this gorgeous baby boy, and she looks at him and she says, I have to protect him, I have to look after him, I can't let anything happen to him. And so she hides him for as long as she can, so that the Egyptians can't do him no harm. But when it gets to the stage where he's getting too big and she can hide him no more, she has to put him in the basket and send him up the river in order to keep him safe. But Miriam, his big sister, she's the one following him along the river and peeking out the long grass and saying, is he alright, is he okay? Keeping a wee eye on him and making sure he's safe. And when Moses gets up the river, he gets to this Egyptian princess and she picks him up and she looks after him. But Miriam, she's quite quick thinking, and she goes to the Egyptian princess and she says, I know someone who can look after him for you. I know someone who can be his nanny. I know someone who can mind him for you and give you a hand with him. And she runs home and gets her mummy, gets Moses' mummy, and brings her to look after Moses. And we all know the story about how Moses then grows up and God speaks to him and God says, I'm not happy about how the Egyptians have treated my people. I'm not happy about the fact that they're stuck in slavery and they're being hurt and they're being abused. And Moses, I want you to go and set them free. And we all know the story. Moses is a wee bit hesitant, he's a wee bit afraid at first. But then he goes and he leads the people, he leads the Israelites, he leads his people out of Egypt and on a road to freedom, on a road away from slavery. And whenever they're walking out of Egypt, and Moses is leading the people to freedom, the Egyptians come after them, and they've nowhere to go because they get to the Red Sea. So the Red Sea's in front of them, the Egyptians are behind them, and they're stuck they're nowhere to go. But on this road to freedom, on this road out of Egypt and into freedom, God is the one who's been leading and guiding them the whole time. The Bible tells us that during the day, God would lead them with the pillar of cloud. And during the day, they'd look at that pillar of cloud, and when the pillar of cloud moved, they moved, and they followed it wherever it went. And at night time, God would appear to them as a pillar of fire, and when the pillar of fire moved, and they followed it wherever it went. And they get to the Red Sea, and everybody starts to freak out, everybody starts to get a bit afraid, and they say to Moses, Moses, why have you brought us out here to get killed? We're better off back in Egypt. At least back in Egypt we would have survived. Everybody gets afraid and everybody freaks out. And this is a part of the story that I want to get to. In Exodus chapter 14, verse 19 to 27, that's where God leads them across the Red Sea on dry land. It says, then the angel of God, who had been leading the people of Israel, moved to the rear of the camp. The pillar of cloud also moved from the front and stood behind them. The cloud settled between the Egyptians and the Israelite camp, so God sat in the middle of the two camps and kept the Israelites safe. As darkness fell, the cloud turned to fire, lighting up the night, but the Egyptians and the Israelites did not approach each other all night. And then Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord opened up the path through the water with a strong east wind, and the wind blew all that night, turning the seabed into dry land. So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, and with the walls of water on each side. And then the Egyptians and Pharaoh's horses and chariots chased them into the middle of the sea. And just before the dawn, the Lord looked down from the Egyptian army from the pillar of cloud and fire, and he threw their forces into total confusion. He twisted their chariot wheels, making their chariots difficult to drive. Let's get out of here, away from these Israelites, the Egyptians shouted. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. And when all the Israelites reached the other side, the Lord said to Moses, raise your hand over the sea again, and the waters will rush back and cover the Egyptians and their chariots and charioteers. So the sun began to rise. Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the water rushed back to its usual place. The Egyptians tried to escape, but the Lord swept every one of them into the sea. So God made a way where there didn't seem to be no way, and God got them through when they thought they were stuck and whenever they were afraid. And Miriam, Moses' sister, what does she do? Well, this is a bit that I want to get to. In Exodus 15 verse 20, it says, then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine and led all the women, and they played their tambourines and they danced. And Miriam sang this song, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. He has hurled both horse and rider into the sea. Miriam, who was the sister of Moses, led all the women, and they got their tambourines, they got a beat going, and they started moving, and they started dancing, and they started worshiping. Why did Miriam dance? Well, I believe she danced because she had seen God do absolutely amazing things. I'm sure it had been a long night for them on the road to freedom. I'm sure it had been a long night waiting for that wind to blow and waiting for the sea to part. But Miriam knew that as long as the wind was blowing, God was moving. As long as the wind was blowing, God was doing something. And I'm sure it was scary for them, looking at the Egyptians on the other side who were coming after them, trying to make them slaves again. But God still protected them. God still seen them through. When Miriam got through to the other side of the water, when Miriam got through the Red Sea, she was able to look back and go, I'm free. I'm free. My life's going to be different now. No more torment, no more slave labour, no more being treated like dirt, no more being treated like somebody else's property. Finally, after all these years, I'm free. And Miriam could look back from that point on the story and see how God had always had his hand upon her life. She could look back and see how God had used her to protect Moses when he was the baby in the basket. She could look back and see how God had used her to be a support to Moses when he was leading the people to freedom. And that's the reason she danced. God had been faithful through her. God had been faithful to her, and he'd seen her through. And so she gets all the women together and she starts dancing and she starts giving her praise and her worship to God. And for each and every one of us, I'm sure like Miriam, there's maybe been times in our lives when we've looked back and we've thought, my goodness, God, what on earth is going on? I don't see a way forward, I don't see a way back. God, this is really scary. God, I don't know what's happening here. But I'm sure there's also times like Miriam when you can look back and you can see how God's always had his hand upon your life. You can see how God has protected you in different situations, where you can see how maybe he's kept you safe and how he's seen you through different circumstances. And you might be like me, you might not be a dancer, but like Miriam, you can choose to give your praise and to give your worship and to give your thanks to God. And you can choose to tell others, look what God has done for me. And see, if he's done it for me, then he can do it for you too. And Miriam rejoiced and Miriam danced because of what God had brought her through. And my prayer when I looked at that story was simply, Lord, will you teach me to dance? Will you teach me how to look back and see how you've always had your hand on my life, so that I can look forward, knowing that whatever I face, you're going to be right there beside me. Miriam could have felt sorry for herself, and she could have said, why could things not have been just a bit more straightforward? Why do we have to go through all this? This is bad and that's bad and this is terrible, and look what all we're going through. But no, she didn't feel sorry for herself. She chose to see how God had brought her through. She chose to see his hand on everything. She chose to be grateful, and she chose to dance and to worship. And for me, that's an amazing example to follow, to choose to believe that God is always in control, and to choose to give him our worship and our praise when we can look back and see what he brings us through, and we can know that he's always with us no matter what we might face. So that was Miriam's dance. The second person that I want to talk about today who danced was King David. And again, I'll give you a wee bit of background to his story, because it kind of, to me, it helps it make a bit more sense as to why he danced. So back in the Old Testament, there was this big golden box, and it was called the Ark of the Covenant. Most of you will probably have heard of it. And inside the Ark of the Covenant, there were different things that were considered holy or were considered sacred. One of the things you had in the Ark of the Covenant was Aaron's rod, who was Moses' brother. So they put Aaron's rod in the Ark of the Covenant. They had the 10 Commandments in there, and they had a pot of manna. Manna was the food that God used to feed the people of Israel when they were stuck in the desert. And so they had all these sacred holy things in this golden box in the Ark of the Covenant. And wherever the Ark of the Covenant went, the blessings and the presence of God followed. So everybody knew how special the Ark of the Covenant was. Everybody knew how holy it was and how sacred it was. In fact, it was so holy that the Bible tells you you weren't even allowed to touch it or you died. Only the priests and a certain group of people called the Levites were allowed to carry it, and it had to be carried and it had to be looked after in a certain way. God had given his people instructions about how he wanted the Ark of the Covenant to be looked after. And what happened for King David was, whenever David became king, his enemies, the Philistines, had captured the Ark, they'd taken it away, and it was David's dream to bring it home. David's dream was, I want to bring the Ark of the Covenant home. I want to bring it back to God's people where it belongs, because he knew when the Ark comes home, the blessings and the presence of God follows. And so what David does is he rallies his troops, he gets his army together, and he says, right men, we're going to go and we're going to bring back the Ark home. But David didn't do it the right way. David kind of messed up and he made mistakes because he didn't follow the instructions that God gave him. And instead of carrying it a specific way and following the rules, they kind of rush in and they put the Ark of the Covenant on this cart. And the cart isn't steady, and the Ark of the Covenant starts to wobble, and there's this man named Uzzah, and he puts his hand out to steady the Ark, and because he wasn't supposed to touch it, he actually loses his life. And so the story goes that David freaks out, David gets afraid, and he says, we're moving this thing no further. We're moving this thing no further. So he leaves the Ark of the Covenant at the house of this man called Obed-Edom, and the Ark stays there for 3 months. And over those 3 months, everybody's coming to David and saying, David, you should see what's happening for Obed-Edom. You should see the things that God's doing for him. God's really blessing him because the Ark of the Covenant is in his house. And so 3 months go by and David's hearing all this. And so David's dream is still to bring the Ark home. And so he says, we're going to have another go at this. We're going to go and we're going to try again. And this time he goes and he tries to bring the Ark of the Covenant home. And this time he does it properly. And you can read about it in 2 Samuel chapter 6 through verse 12 through to 15. It says, then King David was told, the Lord has blessed Obed-Edom's household and everything that he has because of the Ark of God. And so David went there and he brought the Ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with a great celebration. After the men who were carrying the Ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, David sacrificed a bull and a fatted calf. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, wearing a priestly garment. So David and all the people of Israel brought up the Ark of the Lord with shouts of joy and a blowing of the ram's horn. Notice how this time in the story, when he's bringing the Ark home, it's totally different. Notice instead of how putting it on a cart, it was carried in the way that God wanted it to be carried. Notice how instead of just rushing in, they stopped every few steps. They offer their praises and their sacrifices and their worship to God. There was more of a reverence this time. There was more of a respect. There was more of an obedience for what God wanted them to do. And it says that David danced. And when you look back at the original meaning of how he danced, He jumped and he leaped and he twirled about and he danced as best he could. He used up all his energy and he rejoiced and he celebrated because his dream had finally come true. The Ark of the Covenant had finally come home, and he knew that the blessings and the presence of God would follow. Notice as well in here, the second time, what David wore. David wore, we're told, a priestly garment or a plain linen ephod, a plain linen robe. And what he had done was he'd taken off anything that sort of set him apart as a king. He'd taken off his crown, he'd taken off his royal robes, he'd taken off his royal armour as a sign and as a symbol that, do you know what, there's only one true king and it's God, and he's the king of his people. So David did that as a sign of lowering himself and lifting up God, as a sign of being reverent and humble. And that was his dance. It was a reverent, humble, joyful celebration that the ark had returned and that God was the one true king of his people. And so that's why David danced. But the problem in this story was that not everybody liked David's dancing. Not everybody enjoyed David's dance. I know how I feel because not everybody enjoys my dancing either. And one of the people who didn't like his dance was his wife, Michal. Michal's a funny name for a woman, but that's what you called David's wife. And we'll read this next part of the story. It says, "But as the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, who was David's wife, looked down from her window and she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she was filled with contempt for him. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its special place, in the special tent that David had prepared for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. And when he had finished his sacrifices, David blessed the people in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies. And then he gave every Israelite man and woman in the crowd a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins. And then all the people returned to their homes. But when David returned to bless his own family, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him. And she said in disgust, 'How distinguished the king of Israel looked today, shamelessly exposing himself to servant girls like any vulgar person might do.' And David said to Michal, 'I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me above your father and all his family. He appointed me as the leader of Israel, the people of the Lord, and so I celebrate. Yes, I am willing to look even more foolish than this, even to be humiliated in my own eyes. But those servant girls you mentioned will indeed think that I am distinguished.' And it says that Michal, the daughter of Saul, remained childless throughout her life. And what most Bible scholars think is that David wanted nothing more to do with his wife. They had no more relationship, and so that's why she ended up not having any kids. But David's wife, she's disgusted at him. She's angry and she says, you look like an idiot. She's annoyed that he's taken off his royal robes, and she's more worried about appearances. She's more worried about position and power and prestige than she is about praising God. And she basically says to David, 'You're not acting like a king, you're acting like an Egypt, and you are embarrassing me.' But David didn't care what she thought, and he says, 'I'm dancing because God chose me.' David, who had made mistakes and messed up the first time that he tried to get the Ark of the Covenant home, was grateful that God had given him a second chance to make his dreams come true. And my prayer when I looked at this story was again, 'Lord, will you teach me to dance? Lord, will you teach me to care more about pleasing you and praising you than what people think? Will you teach me to be humble and reverent the way David was? And will you teach me to try again when I mess up the first time, just like David did? And teach me to celebrate you and give you all the glory and give you all the honour when you answer my prayers and you bring my dreams to pass, just like David did.' David wasn't perfect. He might have messed up, but he still had a heart after God, and he was determined to worship God through dancing. And again, for me, that's an amazing example to follow. Because like David, there's times when I mess up and I don't get it right the first time, and there's times when I have to go back and try again. But God's always willing to give us a second chance, and because of that, I believe he deserves to be praised and deserves to be worshipped, just the way David praised and worshipped him that day whenever he danced. So, we've looked at Miriam's dance, we've looked at David's dance, and now the question is, what about us? What about you and me? Because if you're anything like me, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, Lauren, they're great stories. They're lovely stories. That's brilliant that Miriam danced, and that's amazing that King David danced. But if you think I'm going to come to New Generation Family Church on a Sunday morning and start dancing while Stuart's singing, then you have another thing coming. I think the only one I ever catch dancing in here is BJ. She's not even here this morning, but BJ likes to dance, and so does Kirsty. Kirsty's a good dancer as well. But the rest of us, I think the rest of us are pretty content with trying to keep the beat of clapping. But and that's fair enough. That is totally fair enough. I've seen some dodgy dancing in my day in church. I've seen people doing the holy hop. I've seen people do spiritual dancing, and some of it's brilliant. When it's done right, it is amazing, but some of it's a wee bit crazy and a wee bit wacky and a wee bit out there. So how does this whole dancing thing apply to you and apply to me? Well, I'll tell you a story of what happened to me a few years ago. Whenever, a couple of years ago, I was organising our kids' nativity play, and I found this song that I really loved by Danny Goki called Lift Up Your Eyes, a brilliant song, and I had it on repeat in my car, and I knew this song back to front, I knew it inside out, and I said to Rebecca, I give Rebecca the song, and everybody knows Rebecca's a dancer, so I give her the song and I says, can you play that and get your dance team to do a dance to it? And she says, right, okay, no problem. Well, we came down here and Rebecca must have listened to it for about 10 seconds, turned it off and went, okay, that's 2 quick 8s, I need you to stand here and you to stand here, and away we go. And I thought to myself, what is she talking about 2 quick 8s? She hasn't even heard this song yet. How does she know what 2 quick, how is she getting that? I've heard this song 100 times, what on earth is she talking about? But Rebecca's a dancer, and she was listening to the song a lot more closely than I was. She was listening to the beat, she was listening to the rhythm, she was counting, she was tapping, and she was planning in her head. See, I was just listening to it going, brilliant song, but Rebecca was listening to it a whole lot more closely than I was, because the job of a dancer is to listen to rhythm, listen to the beat, and move along with it. That's what the job of a dancer is. And for me and you, as Christians, we're called to listen to the voice of God, to get so close to Him that we listen to the rhythm of His heart and move along with it. And when we do that, our lives become an act of worship, our lives become a dance that's pleasing to God. And I thought to myself, what would happen if in our lives we did what Rebecca did with the song that I gave her that day? What would happen if instead of just listening to the words that we sing in church and thinking, that's a nice song, what if we really tried to grab a hold of it? What if we really tried to get God's heartbeat behind it? Or what if instead of listening to a sermon or reading a verse and going, that was nice, that really encouraged me, what if we really tried to get God's heartbeat behind it? What if we tried to draw so near to Him that we could hear His very heartbeat? Because the Bible makes it clear that God is a God who wants to be near to us. God is a God who wants to be close to us. He promises us in James 4:8 that if you draw near to God, He will draw near to you. Hebrews 4:16 says, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find help when we need it the most. And if we take time to shut off everything else, spend that time alone with God and say, Lord, I want to draw near to you again. I want to draw so close that I can catch the rhythm of your heartbeat. And when you do that, you'll find that His heartbeats for different things. You'll find that His heartbeats for people. You'll find that His heartbeats for people who are hurting and who are broken. And maybe when you catch the rhythm of God's heartbeat for people who are hurting and broken, you'll begin to move along to it. Maybe you'll say, well, how can I help that person down the road? What can I do for them? Or maybe like my daddy said this morning, you can just go and listen and be there for someone who's hurting and broken when you catch the rhythm of God's heartbeat. Or maybe when you listen to God's heartbeat, you'll hear that it beats for people who are lost, people who don't know Him yet, and you'll start to move along with it. Maybe you'll say to yourself, well, how can I tell my friends in work about church on Sunday, about what I heard? How can I tell them about what God's done in my life? How can I bring God into conversation with people who don't know Him? How can I tell them about Him? Because His heartbeat is for people who are lost and don't know Him yet. Maybe when you draw close to God and you listen to His heartbeat, you'll hear that it beats for His church to rise up and be all that it can be. And maybe when you catch God's heartbeat for His church, maybe you'll say, well, hold on a minute, how can I get involved? How can I get involved and help out in this ministry or that ministry? Or who can I invite the church to kind of move it forward and get it built up a bit? And when you catch God's heartbeat like that and you begin to move along with it, then your life becomes a dance. Your life becomes an act of worship for God. And my prayer today was, Lord, teach me to dance. Teach me to catch the rhythm of your heartbeat and move along with it as best I can, so that my life moves along with what you want me to do. I've got one more story about dancing just to kind of finish off, and hopefully this will just kind of encourage someone today. I heard a story about a young girl years ago who was an amazing ballet dancer. She was a ballet dancer and she was fantastic at what she did. She was so graceful, she was so elegant, she was brilliant, and she got the lead part in Swan Lake, which is a big ballet production. She was the lead role because she was so good at what she did. And as she got older, this woman, whenever she got into her elder years, she developed dementia. And dementia, you'll know, is a condition that kind of causes confusion, causes trouble in your mind. It can steal your peace, like my daddy was talking about earlier, and it can kind of make it feel as if your world is falling apart. It's hard for your family to watch. And this lady suffered from dementia, and sometimes she didn't know what day it was, sometimes she didn't recognise her family, and this was heartbreaking for her family to watch. But what someone did, someone had the genius idea one day to bring in for her the music of Swan Lake that she had danced to all them years ago. And when she heard that music, to their amazement, her arms began to move again, and she started to do the moves that she did all them years ago. See, the dancer was still there inside of her. And what I believe God would say today is that sometimes, I don't know what kind of week everybody's had, people might have had a brilliant week out in the sun, people might have had a really hard week, a really tough week, a week where you feel like your mind's confused and you're like, God, what on earth is going on in my life? But I believe that what God would say is that if you draw near to me and you listen to my heartbeat and you take my hand, then I'll show you how to dance again. I'll show you how to dance again. And Psalm 30:11 says, you have turned my mourning into joyful dancing. He can take what you're going through and he can help you dance again. All you have to do is draw near, listen to his heartbeat and move along with it. So just to finish off, dancing is an act of worship. Miriam danced to rejoice and to give thanks to God for everything that he brought her through. She refused to feel sorry and think, why did all that happen to me? She moved. David danced because God had given him a second chance and made his dreams come true. And when we draw close to God and when we listen to his heartbeat and move along with it, then our lives can become an act of worship. Our lives can become a dance that's pleasing to him. Even if you're like me and you haven't got a beat in your body. That's everything I have to say. Thank you.